My name is Ricardo Soares de Oliveira. I'm a professor of international politics at the University of Oxford. I'm also the co-editor of African Affairs, the journal of the Royal African Society. Welcome to my exp. The extractive industries, by which we mean oil, gas, and mining in Africa, are absolutely crucial for the continent. In fact, they're the biggest source of exports from Africa onto the world economy. And for all but a handful of states, the government revenues of African governments tend to come from these sectors. And this impacts on anything from the way they deal with the outside world to the way the governments deal with their own populations. In terms of international relations, this means that governments that have access, that have possession of oil and natural resources tend to be quite empowered in their outside relations with other states, with oil and mining companies, etc. And internally, it also makes a difference. It means that African governments that have these revenues coming to them from the extractive industries don't need to tax their own populations. They have their own alternative sources of revenue. Another impact that this has is because they have this ready source of revenue, they don't need to develop other sectors. So there's very little incentive for them to develop industrial sectors or agricultural sectors, which in the long term further consolidates their dependence on oil, gas, and mining. You have many examples of the impact of natural resources on African governance. You could start with Nigeria, which is the largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa, and an economy which in the 1960s still had a very large agricultural sector. In fact, its biggest export sector were agriculturally related. As soon as oil became the biggest sector, that led to the underdevelopment of almost every other aspect of the economy. From the late 90s, you did start to have the financial sector developing a bit, but the oil remains absolutely central to the economy, and it prevents the development of other alternative sources of income. Other examples include Angola, which is the third largest economy on the continent. Again, a country that before the coming of oil and diamond wealth used to have an economy that was much more diversified, but which in the long term has become so dependent on oil revenues that the incentives to produce anything else and to make the hard choices that are necessary in order for other sectors to be pushed forward are entirely lacking. These are oil experiences, but if you look at countries such as Zambia, one of the world's leading exporters of copper, or countries like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has a plethora of mining sources and one of the wealthiest countries in the world in mining terms. But the impact this has had on the trajectory of the economy is absolutely dismal. There's nothing intrinsic to mining wealth, to oil, that should account for those outcomes. Some experts have spoken of a resource curse, whereby states that are wealthy in natural resources paradoxically end up with much worse outcomes in terms of development. But that tends to overstate the direct outcomes, the automatic outcomes that resource wealth produces in terms of poverty, in terms of lack of development. I think it's important, whether we're looking at the DRC, Angola, or Nigeria, to look not just on the properly economic impact of natural resources, but the political choices that post-colonial elites have made about development, which sectors they decided to develop, which sectors they neglected, how they governed the economy, what choices they made about investing in the long term. So we need to look at the economic base of these countries, but also the political story behind the wealth that they have. The first thing to understand in regards to oil in Africa is that Africa has about 10 to 12% of all the available oil in the world. So it doesn't seem to be as important. It isn't as important as the Persian Gulf or other parts of the world. But there are some specific points about how oil works in Africa that make it very important. There are many, many areas of the world, think the Middle East, for instance, where foreign companies are not really welcome. You have national oil companies owned by those countries that extract most of the oil. And they're not really keen on foreign investors to come in and play that role. Africa is different. Africa is, as an oil province, a part of the world where foreign companies are welcome, where Exxon and BP and Royal Dutch Shell can still own acreage. They can still go there and buy oil wells, extract the oil, and then have that oil sold in the international system, having had very favorable tax terms from the governments in Africa. So both because they can access the oil and because those tax terms are very favorable to corporations, Africa looms large in the agendas of not just the big Western corporations that I mentioned, but also increasingly Asian corporations from countries like Brazil, etc., etc.